All right, welcome back. We are now on to episode 5 of our tutorial series where we're building a video game. And in the last one, we went ahead and created our very own renderer. And now we're going to upgrade our renderer so that it can actually batch different images. So currently right now, we can only load one image, that's being the little flesh guy sprite. So kind of a teaser as to what I mean. This right here, so we're going to add a nice grassy little background for our character to roam around in. So we can still, move a character around, but now we have some like green grass tiles to walk around with. Yeah, so without further ado, let's go ahead and start coding. And to start, and how we're going to be batching things, we're going to be using different, or a new concept called a material. And what a material is, it's a combination of a shader as well as a texture object. So we're just going to be utilizing what we already have with shader and texture, except like different images batches will rely upon different materials, but different materials can have the same shader and the same texture. They could be using, the same texture but with a different shader, or a different texture but the same shader. So that's pretty much why we're going to be creating the material object here. So let's go ahead and make a header file here, call this material. And let's see what we need here. I don't think we need to include anything. So we'll go ahead and class material define here. And one thing that materials do keep in track of, if you remember from our renderer video, we did this pretty nasty solution for rendering one single image, where we pretty much just use the default image size, or the default image to render towards. Where is that? Oh, it's in texture. Yeah, in this texture bind, we're pretty much binding to the default image. We're going to have to change that because we're going to have different textures that we want to bind to. So this is going to have to change to something else. So we're going to be removing this out of texture, but we're going to leave this bind texture 2D with ID. That's totally fine. So let's go ahead and move that. And that's going to be in our material class soon enough. But we're going to have to generate different IDs. So we're just going to use a try old true solution of just holding a static integer. And we're going to call that ID gen. It looks like we're going to need our GL include. So let's go ahead and include that here. So glad.h. Get rid of those errors. And this is what I was talking about. This is the text unit. So GLUint text unit. So that's what I have on clipboard right now. We'll be copying and pasting that into a section that's neatly tied to texture. So we're going to be calling it bind, except it's going to be towards the material. Inside of material class, as I said, it's going to be a holding class for textures. So let's go ahead and define texture. It's going to be public, and then shader. So this will be shader. And let's do some includes here. Shader.h, texture.h, and then we'll also have an ID. So an ID. This ID is going to be different. Oh yeah, so that's what this ID gen is. I think I confused that a bit. But each material, we're going to be just assigning a regular integer ID to it. This is just for like quicker like comparison operators. So we're not just comparing on like pointer values. We're actually comparing to like solid integer values. So we're going to be using ID gen and just incrementing that every single time we create a new material. And it's going to be really simple but very beautiful at the same time. So So let's go ahead and define our material header file. So we're going to need to input a texture. So make sure that's defined as a parameter in the constructor, and a shader. Same deal here with that. And then what text unit we want to be rendering our image towards. So this isn't like, with like text units, it's kind of specific to like what what state you're in for the game. So you, like, if you're using like multiple different images and you want to use it in like a certain setting, you're gonna have to like mess around with the text unit value. But and we'll change this in the future to make it a bit easier on ourselves. But let's also define material deconstructor. Just call it default. But for now, we're just going to hard code the text unit so that we can just get it done with and not have to worry about it later. In the future, like the game state's going to handle the text unit, so this is going to be it's going to be removed in the future. That's kind of what I was trying to explain out. And then we have two helper functions. That's going to be compile, so like shader compile. So we go to shader.h. We also have we have a use. Oh no, here we go. Compile. Well, that's not the right compile. Compile is just going to be setting up uniforms. I think that's what I have it set at. So compile just to set up uniforms. Shader uniforms, and then void bind, which is going to be dealing with texture setups. So texture setups. And in the future, we're going to have multiple different material classes that handle different uniform setups, handle different like texture binding and whatnot. But right now, we're just going to just have it as a single setup, as it's just easier that way, and then changing it in the future just makes more sense. All right. So let's go ahead and make our material.cpp, because for some reason 2022 doesn't set it up for you. .cpp already exists. Of course it does. Thank you. Thank you for creating it and then not creating the definition of it. Visual Studio is very cool. All right, let's go ahead and create those definitions. Start implementing. So we remember correctly in our keyboard. So binding this is for textures. Bindings for setting up textures. On our clipboard here, just going to go ahead and paste in. We're going to paste in GL active texture. Except instead of at GL texture 0, we're going to add a extra little bit in here. So that's going to be plus the text unit that we set up. And then we're also going to have to set up whatever our texture needs. So we're going to have to bind that. So let's go ahead and call texture.bind. And then let's just figure out the constructor here. What is that? Texture, shader, and text unit. Really simple stuff. Now for our compile, we are going to have to add some new stuff to our shader, don't we? Let's see here. Set up our shader. No, that's not. Well, I mean, that's our shader class, our actual shader. So you have text coordinates. Here we go. Sampler 2D image. I think in the main we're setting that up. Let me see here. Shader set. Oh, I guess we just don't set the image at all. Well, we're going to start using that now. I guess it just it's auto to 0. Is that right? Since our text slot's in the 0 slot, to just defaulted. Since we didn't set it, it's just zeroed out, and it's very cool. But now we're going to have to actually set it since we're switching between different images. So to do that, we're going to call our shader and our use function, which is just going to activate our shader so that we can use, or so we can edit it, or edit our uniforms to be precise. And then we're going to call setInt, and I think it's called image. We go to sprite.fs, sampler2d image, correct. And we're going to input our text units so that our shader and texture are lined up properly, and we render the right image to the screen. So that should about do it for our material. So now we just have to implement it into our renderer, as well as be able to handle batching together different images. So to do that, let's add a few extra functions here. So void begin, and then void end. And these are just going to be just like helper functions for the main class to just render a bit easier. So we're defining it a bit better. So void.end is just going to flush out our renderer. And begin, we're going to have to input our material again. So let's go ahead and include material. And we'll define material as a pointer. This is going to be cur material. And what begin is going to do is it's going to take our cur material and make sure that it's null pointered out so that we can set the cur material to different batches at a different point. And I'll show you how exactly we're going to do that. But another thing to start off with is we're going to have to change draw to now input a material into its parameters. So here we go. Here's material. Let's go down to our renderer and fix this up here. All right. So now we have a material here. We're not actually setting up or binding anything, and we don't actually bind anything until we flush it out. But we have to check to see if we're at a different batch or we're currently working on the same image or the same material, to be exact. So to do that, we're just going to have to make a giant if statement here. And let's see here. So if the buffer, so this buffer dot size, and we're beyond the max amount of sprites we want to define, so I guess we should also define that. Let's see. So now that we are dealing with a bunch of different images, we might want to put a cap on how many images we're drawing on the screen per batch. So let's define that as max sprites. And then we'll put it in our private of our renderer, the same name, max sprites. And then render.cpp. Make sure it's included here as well. Oh, I should probably define the GLU int as well. Max sprites, max sprites. And that is all done. So if our buffer goes outside of our designated max sprite range, so it's greater than the amount of max sprites there are. Let's see. But our buffer isn't currently calibrated in sprites, so we have to do a bit of math to find exactly if we're within that range correctly or not. So this dot max sprites multiplied by this dot is it multiplied by 2? I'm timesing it by itself. I don't understand what I'm doing here. I think this is wrong. I think what I wrote in my actual live code is just incorrect because I'm just multiplying it by itself. I think I just have to multiply it by vertices and like the whatchamacallit. What did I define it as? It's down here, the attribute size. So vertices, so we currently have we're drawing with a bot or like a square. So we have 6 vertices, so 1 for each of these. And then the max attribute size, so this dot match max attribute, or at size is what I called it. So this will check if our buffer is outside of our max sprite range. I actually need to change that in my live code. I didn't realize I wrote that wrong. And we also have to check if our current material is null. So if it is not null, we want to, or if it is null, we want to make sure something is working correctly. And then we want to check this whole part first before checking this next bit. So if it's a null pointer, we want to make sure we're calling this function. And that is if the current, if the material that we defined in the draw function here is different than the material. Oh, this is supposed to be, God, I'm just all over the place today on this tutorial. That is, we're passing by reference. We don't want to make sure, we're making sure we're not making a copy there. So the last bit that we're checking before if we're like flushing or not is the current material.id does not match, or does not match with the current material ID. So this .id, if those don't match, then that means we're on to a different batch and we need to flush out the current batch. So we'll call this .flush, and current material we're going to set to a pointer of the material that we just defined in our draw. So this will now, at every single draw frame, check to see if we can add on this batch of like rectangles of sprites to the current batch, and if so, if they have the same material, then it will just continue to push back on our buffer. However, it's a different material, or we're starting over the batch again. So maybe it's the same material, but we want to start over. Like if it's null, then we also want to make sure that we're starting with a new batch and that there's nothing inside of our buffer. All right, the next bit that we should accomplish here, we just got to do some checks in our flush now that we're dealing with multiple different images. If this .buffer.empty, we want to make sure we're just exiting as soon as possible. And then also if it's a null pointer for material, so this current material is a null pointer, we want to clear the buffer, so this buffer.clear, and then return as well. So we just make sure we're getting everything accomplished, or we're doing our proper checks before. Now we will be calling or using our material in the proper way. So we're going to go ahead and compile and bind it. Now this episode is kind of reaching the end here, so I'm just going to kind of hurry through the next bit, but I've kind of explained, I think, in decent detail to what I was doing with that. Let's go ahead and make sure we have that attached. And then we're going to need to define some new materials here. But to do that, let's go ahead and add a new texture. So let's go find image file path 2. So I added a new image. It's called grass.png inside of our images folder. Let's see if I can just pull it up here. This is what it looks like. It's just a single 64 by 64 tile. And I went ahead and put that into our resources folder. So let's go ahead and define that here. And we'll have to load and create some different, we don't need that anymore, but we will still need to load. Let's go make another texture object. So let's call this texture 2. We could be more creative, call it grass, because that's a better name, but we called it image file path 2, which was also pretty lazy. And a lot of this stuff is just kind of, it's code we're going to be deleting in the future. So as we're going to optimize our project so that it can actually hold a video game together, we'll go ahead and delete a lot of this stuff. Anyways, let's go ahead and define our materials here. So we're not going to create a new shader. We're going to use the same shader for both, but we're going to have different materials. So this is grass mat. And inside of grass mat, we have, let me go to our material, texture, shader, text unit. Okay. So our texture is texture 2 for grass mat. And then our shader is just shader. Our text unit, let's put it on text unit 1. And then we'll do, I don't know, let's call him flesh guy. He kind of looks like that. And we'll go ahead and set up the same way, except instead of 0, or instead of 1, we'll put it on 0. And then let's go ahead and I'm just going to copy and paste this this for loop where I go over, I make like a huge column out of our window. But I don't really feel like setting up or going through the code. I'm just going to go ahead and copy and paste it like so. I guess we're going to need some other helper files. And I'll go over exactly what this function is and what exactly I'm doing. It's a really simple for loop. It's not really that difficult or really needs that much explaining. Let's see, this is flesh guy material. Yes, and then that's grass mat. So these are grass dests, and that's just defined every single time. That looks good. So pretty much what I'm doing is I'm setting up columns based on what the screen size is divided by 64. So this is how many columns there are, this is how many rows there are, and this is the total amount of grass we're going to be drawing. And then I just do a for loop, I iterate through, define the grass at every single in the grid, and then we just draw it. So if we go ahead and run this, we should be getting the beginning demo here, which looks like we did not. That is interesting. We got the grass to work. It looks like we we have a grass moving around, so that's not good. So let's see what happened here. Texture.load, file path 2. I wonder if that has something to do with our bind. Let's see, that's text unit. Set int, looks good. Yeah, that's interesting. I wonder what I did wrong here. I don't know why I'm looking at texture. Should be fine with GL bind, material.cpp. I think it has to be material that's messing it up. am I, let me see here. My renderer, am I compiling and binding correct? That looks right. Setting up the current material. Let's see here. GeoBind texture. This text unit. Yeah, I have no idea. I have no idea why this is not working. That looks fine to me. It's even in the right order. Oh, I did not set up ID gen, so they have the same ID. Okay. Yeah. No, that's that's an issue. All right, so we have to do ID is equal to ID gen plus plus. So they're set up the same ID. Of course they don't freaking work. They're batched together. Yeah, let's go ahead and define that here. So I was just going through this so quickly that I just completely flubbed the entire thing. That's fair. Let's go ahead and set up, since it's a static function, we have to define it in a CPP file like that. And now, if we run it, it's going to work. Well, you'll notice there's a little bit of an issue here. And that is our image doesn't show transparency pixels. So we actually have to define that, and we have to set it up in OpenGL so that we can see through our image, our PNG. So to do that, let's go to main. What is the function called? Let's go ahead and do this. I think before we're knitting shaders, so let's do it after glad maybe. And we'll just set up a few things. One, we're going to set up the viewport. So geo viewport at 0, 0. And this is just going to help out with making sure our window looks right on different screen sizes. So let's set up the viewports like so. If you omit that, your program's still going to work fine. It's not really going to change anything. And then the next bit, we'll go ahead and enable GL blend. And what this will do is allow our images to blend with the background. So to do that, we also have to call the function GL blend func. And then we'll go ahead and say GL source alpha. Because that's what we want. We want to blend with. So all the alpha channels, it's going to be blending with GL1 minus source alpha. So the image behind it, that's how it's going to handle alpha, or just transparency. So if we run that again, and you'll notice we have a running game, so everything is working correctly now. So congratulations if you went through this far. This is a pretty long episode, 28 minutes. I hope you enjoyed this one. Let me know if I am going over topics a bit too quickly, not quickly enough. This stuff's fun, but it's kind of hard to grasp, especially if you're just starting out. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next episode.